July 16, 1941, near Smolensk on the western front of the Soviet Union. The air trembled before dawn, heavy with dew and the stench of gasoline and burned rubber. Along a tree-lined road outside the village of Orsha, German officers of the 29th Motorized Division stood beside their Opel Blitz trucks, sipping bitter coffee, laughing. They had heard rumors something about the Soviets deploying new rocket trucks, crude contraptions bolted to the back of lorries. One officer, Oberstleutnant Karl Wehner, smirked as he flicked his cigarette to the mud. Another peasant toy, he said. No sights, no accuracy, just noise. He had no idea that within minutes the horizon behind the tree line would ignite with light dozens of streaking flames tearing through the fog like burning comets. The first salvo hit the German rear positions. The second landed squarely in the middle of a supply convoy. Within seconds, engines screamed, ammunition trucks detonated, and the laughter died in a wave of flame and twisted metal. That was the morning the Wehrmacht learned to fear a sound that would haunt them for the rest of the war, the rising howl of the Katyusha. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa were a fever dream for the German army. Every road east seemed to lead to another Soviet collapse, columns of burning tanks, panicked infantry, entire regiments surrendering by the thousands. By July 1941, Smolensk had become the next stepping stone toward Moscow. The officers of the 29th Motorized and 17th Panzer Division believed the Soviet defense had already broken. To them, the war would be over by autumn. Reports of strange Soviet rocket batteries reached headquarters through prisoner interrogations and Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Pilots described trucks carrying racks of metal tubes, but the footage showed nothing impressive, just cheap rails welded to the frames of ZS-6 trucks. German analysts dismissed the contraption as an inefficient psychological weapon. Conventional wisdom held that artillery required precision, and precision required mathematics, optics, and discipline, things the Germans prided themselves on, and the Soviets, they assumed, lacked. At an officers' mess outside Smolensk, the laughter continued. Major Rudolf Kerner, commander of an artillery observation unit, read aloud a captured Soviet leaflet bragging about Stalin's organ, a nickname he found comical. They call it music, he sneered. Then let them play their tune. We have the orchestra. Nearby, young Lieutenant Heinz Bauer cleaned the lens of his rangefinder. He was newly assigned from Berlin, a meticulous man who believed in order tables and geometry. Rockets to him were chaos, a child's weapon. He jotted in his notebook that the Soviets relied on intimidation instead of accuracy. That same evening, Soviet engineers from the 8th Guards Mortar Regiment were preparing their debut. Hidden in the woods east of Orsha, they had camouflaged 7 BM-13 launchers under birch branches. Each truck carried 16 steel rails angled skyward, crude but deadly. Their payload, 132mm M13 rockets, each loaded with nearly 5 kilograms of TNT and a trail of fire that stretched across the sky. Captain Ivan Andreev, the battery commander, received his fire order at 0310. His men, exhausted but resolute, checked fuses under lantern light. The launchers had no targeting optics, only pre-calculated azimuths scribbled on waxed maps. The goal was not to hit a bunker or tank, it was to annihilate everything inside a grid square. At 0327, the final order came through open fire. The forest erupted. 16 rockets left the rails almost simultaneously, their exhaust plumes lighting the trees like molten daylight. The shriek that followed, high, mechanical, unending, rolled across the valley seconds before impact. German soldiers on the opposite ridge looked up confused. Then the earth split open. The first salvo slammed into an ammunition park. A second ripped through a fuel depot. The third blanketed the 29th Division's command post. Each rocket exploded with a concussive thud, not like artillery shells, but as if the air itself had been torn apart. Vehicles flipped, horses scattered, men ran blind through smoke so thick It felt solid. Lieutenant Bauer, thrown to the ground by the blast wave, crawled toward a crater rim and stared in disbelief. The precision he worshipped was useless now. His entire battery had vanished in a red mist. Flames leapt from one truck to another, their heat bending the air. In the distance, more rockets screamed in overlapping waves. To the Soviet crews, it was a symphony of vengeance. They watched through periscopes as the German lines disintegrated the horizon, glowing orange. Captain Andreev gave the next command, calmly, almost reverently, reload. When dawn broke, smoke blanketed the Smolensk highway. Hundreds of bodies lay twisted beside blackened armor. Oberstleutnant Wehner's command truck was a melted shell. The toy weapon had erased his entire motorized column in under 2 minutes. Word of the attack spread through the Wehrmacht like a contagion. Survivors described the sound, the howling, the screaming, as if demons had descended from the sky. From that morning on, even hardened veterans flinched at the first wail of a rocket barrage. The Germans had laughed once. They would never laugh again. The first encounter at Smolensk was only the beginning. What the Wehrmacht dismissed as a curiosity became a phantom that stalked every forest and steppe they crossed. The Soviets had found something new, something primal. They called it the BM-13 Katyusha, but among German troops it earned a darker name, Stalin Organ, Stalin's Organ. In the early days, few understood how the weapon worked. There were no barrels, no recoil systems, no precise aiming mechanisms, just racks of rails mounted on trucks. But what the Germans saw as crude improvisation was in truth brutal efficiency. The launcher could unleash 16 rockets in under 10 seconds, saturating an area of several football fields. Where traditional artillery required hours to relocate, the BM-13 could fire and disappear within minutes. The technology was shockingly simple: solid fuel propellant pressed powder and a delayed ignition system that staggered each rocket by fractions of a second, giving that eerie rising howl that haunted men's sleep. Once fired, the vehicles drove off, leaving only smoke and terror behind. By mid-1941, Soviet engineers at the Voronezh plant were producing dozens of these launchers each week, though in total secrecy. Even within the Red Army, the Guards mortar units were veiled in mystery, assigned no standard insignia, no public mention in reports. Only the highest command levels knew their exact locations. Inside one such factory, workers toiled under flickering lights. The air reeked of paint and cordite. Women worked side by side with old machinists, riveting launch rails and stenciling the Cyrillic letters BM-13 under strict supervision. Every rocket that rolled off the line carried not just explosives, but defiance, a message to the invader that Soviet industry, though wounded, was far from broken. At the same time, in a commandeered building near Warsaw, the Wehrmacht's Weapons Research Division struggled to make sense of what they had witnessed. Fragments of rocket casings were collected, analyzed, and compared. One colonel concluded they were psychological devices intended to cause panic rather than destruction. Another proposed they were chemical dispersal weapons. None had any clue how the Soviets could mass-produce them in such numbers. But the frontline soldiers didn't need reports. They knew. They could hear the difference. In field hospitals from Smolensk to Vyazma, wounded men spoke of the sound, the howl that rises before death. One private described it in a letter home. It begins as a moan, then a scream, then everything turns white. Even the air catches fire. German infantry manuals began including warnings about the BM-13. If the rocket barrage begins, do not run. Lay flat, cover ears, mouth open. Wait. But waiting offered little comfort. The rockets did not discriminate. They erased entire positions, command posts, artillery parks, even medical tents. For the Soviets, Katyusha became more than a weapon. It was revenge wrapped in fire. Crews often painted slogans on their launchers, names of cities, lost relatives, killed, or simply the word Ogon, fire. The moment before each barrage, some soldiers sang softly the wartime folk tune that shared the rocket's name, Katyusha, a song about a girl waiting for her beloved to return from the front. The irony was not lost on them, the gentle melody followed by apocalyptic thunder. By autumn 1941, Katyushas had become central to Soviet counterattacks. In every major battle from Yelnya to Tula, these rocket batteries appeared like ghosts firing and fading into the forests. German air reconnaissance could never track them. Even when Luftwaffe planes spotted trucks, they could not strike fast enough before the launchers moved again. And every time the siren wail of those rockets echoed across the battlefield, German morale cracked a little further. No amount of discipline could steel the nerves against that unnatural chorus of death. In Berlin, propaganda officials tried to downplay the reports, claiming the weapon was wasteful and ineffective. But deep inside OKH Oberkommando des Heeres intelligence logs, one line stood out. Enemy rocket artillery has achieved both material and psychological superiority. They did not know it yet, but the Soviets had discovered a principle that would shape modern warfare, the power of saturation. Not accuracy, not elegance, overwhelming force. The Katyusha was chaos turned into doctrine. July 17th, 1941. Smolensk the next dawn. Smoke still hung over the ravaged plain, curling in oily ribbons above the blackened shells of German trucks. The air was thick, metallic, smelling of ash, scorched oil and death. Survivors of the 29th Motorized Division wandered among the wreckage, their boots crunching over splintered helmets and twisted steel. Somewhere, an engine coughed weakly before dying. The attack had lasted barely 90 seconds, but its aftermath felt eternal. Nearly half the division's transport vehicles were gone, ammunition reserves were destroyed, communication lines severed, command collapsed into chaos. Men who had once marched with precision now moved like ghosts, muttering prayers or staring blankly into the smouldering ruins. Oberstleutnant Wehner, his uniform burned and face caked with soot, staggered toward what remained of his command truck. The once polished insignia of the Wehrmacht now hung blackened and warped across his chest. He dropped to his knees beside a crater the size of a small house. Inside lay nothing but ash. His adjutant, his maps, his radio all vaporized. From the woods beyond, faint mechanical groans echoed the sound of engines distant and retreating. The Soviets were gone. They had fired, vanished, and left only silence in their wake. For the Germans, silence was worse than the barrage. It left space for realization. They were not fighting a broken army of peasants and remnants. They were fighting an enemy that could strike without warning from beyond sight or range and erase entire formations in seconds. Later that morning, Lieutenant Heinz Bauer was found alive under a flipped ST-KFZ 251 half-track. His hearing was gone, replaced by a constant, high-pitched ringing. When medics pulled him out, he muttered a single phrase, over and over. They made the sky scream. Across the battlefield, Soviet scouts crept through the tree line, confirming damage before pulling back. They found shattered anti-aircraft guns, burned transporters, and a field strewn with abandoned helmets. Captain Ivan Andreev's unit had executed their first strike with near perfection, no losses, total devastation. He logged the coordinates, saluted the burning horizon, and ordered the column to move east. By noon, the smell of burning rubber had carried all the way to Smolensk proper, where local civilians watched the sky with mingled awe and terror. They had seen countless bombardments before, but nothing like this. The rockets left contrails of smoke that twisted into spirals above the treetops, glowing red in the dawn light. To them it looked as if the heavens themselves had opened fire. German command at Army Group Center was in turmoil. Reports from the Smolensk sector described unknown rocket weapon and devastation inconsistent with standard artillery. At first, intelligence officers suspected sabotage or hidden minefields. Only after field reconnaissance confirmed the scorched launch positions and rocket fragments did the truth sink in. At 17:00 that evening, General Heinz Guderian's staff received an intercepted Soviet message from the 8th Guards Mortar Regiment. The translation read simply, "Mission accomplished, the enemy broken, long live the motherland." That night, as the sun fell behind the forests, German troops braced for another attack. The front quieted, no shelling, no movement, just an eerie calm. Then faintly at first, a distant wail began to rise from the horizon. It started as a whisper, then grew into a scream that cut through the night. Soldiers dove for cover. Some fired blindly into the darkness. Others froze, paralyzed by the returning memory of the morning's destruction. And then the earth convulsed again. The Katyushas had returned. This time, the Soviets unleashed a full regiment, dozens of trucks firing in staggered waves. The night sky lit up as if dawn had come early. The forest turned into a cathedral of fire, every tree etched in orange light. German lines collapsed under the sheer weight of the barrage. Trucks exploded, horses bolted, ammunition dumps detonated like volcanic eruptions. Inside a command dugout, a radio man screamed into his headset, "Fliegendes Feuer, ganze Division, zerstört flying fire." Entire division destroyed. For the next 48 hours, Smolensk burned. The Katyushas struck again and again, reshaping the battlefield into a smoking wasteland. Wehrmacht reinforcements arriving from Minsk found only silence and ruin. From that day on, every German advance eastward carried a shadow of dread. No one knew when or where the next screaming sky would fall, but they all knew it would. The legend of the Katyusha was born not from propaganda, but from fear. By August 1941, the Soviet High Command understood they had stumbled upon a weapon that could reshape morale as much as it did terrain. The first few deployments of Katyusha batteries near Smolensk and Orsha had proved one thing beyond argument: sheer concentrated terror could be as decisive as bullets. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, newly assigned to coordinate defensive operations, received a report from the 8th Guards Mortar Regiment. It described the Smolensk barrage in terse technical language range, salvo duration, target grid. Yet the final line, handwritten in the margin, stood out: enemy morale completely destroyed. Suggest immediate redeployment to multiple fronts. From that point forward, the Red Army began forming new Guards mortar battalions, each consisting of 4 to 6 Katyusha batteries. They were mobile, fast, and loyal directly to the Stavka, the Soviet General Staff. That autonomy meant they could appear anywhere from the forests of Bryansk to the frozen steppe near Tikhvin with minimal warning to the enemy. The BM-13 system itself was primitive by German standards. Its aiming system relied on simple leveling bubbles and iron stakes hammered into the dirt. Accuracy was poor dispersion wide, but that was the point. The rocket's purpose wasn't to strike a bunker, it was to erase the map. Crews trained obsessively for rapid relocation. Within 3 minutes of firing, they were required to be on the move, engines roaring exhaust shrouded by camouflage smoke. The Germans quickly learned that counter-battery fire was useless. By the time artillery shells landed, the launchers were miles away loading another salvo. At the front, Soviet infantrymen spoke of the Katyushas as if they were divine. Before an attack, they would stop, listen for the signal siren, and then watch the rockets scream over their heads toward the enemy. Men who had been exhausted, half-starved and demoralized would suddenly cheer, shouting, "Let Stalin sing." Each barrage wasn't just fire support, it was theater. A spectacle of revenge played out against the invader who had brought so much suffering. For every village burned, the Soviets answered with a sky on fire. Meanwhile, inside German lines, the psychological damage deepened. Officers reported units abandoning positions at the first sound of incoming rockets. Experienced tank crews described the explosions as waves of air that punched through armor plates. Medical records revealed hundreds of men suffering temporary deafness and trauma with no physical wounds, victims not of shrapnel, but of shock. In one chilling field report dated September 3, 1941, a Wehrmacht doctor wrote, "The weapon causes disorientation, hysteria, and mass paralysis of will. It produces no visible fragments of death, only invisible pressure that crushes the mind." Even as German engineers began developing their own versions, the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, they could not replicate the Katyusha's mobility or volume. The Nebelwerfer fired fewer rockets, required longer setup, and produced a distinctive shriek that often betrayed its position. The Soviets, by contrast, could strike, vanish, and strike again in an endless rhythm of terror. In Moscow, Stalin himself reportedly smiled upon hearing recordings of the first successful barrages. "If the Germans love their precision," he said, "then we will bury them in chaos." And chaos became official doctrine. Soviet tactical manuals rewrote entire sections on artillery coordination, introducing a new term, Ognivoy Val, a wall of fire. This fire curtain was no longer limited to shells. It was now defined by massed rockets timed in sequence with advancing infantry and tank formations. When winter came, the howls of Katyusha rockets became part of the frozen wind. At the Battle of Tula, retreating German troops abandoned hundreds of vehicles in panic after a single regiment fired into their rearguard. One survivor recalled, "The sound seemed to come from everywhere. You didn't know where to run. It was like being trapped inside a furnace." By 1942, Soviet propagandists were circulating stories of the singing angels of vengeance, and even Western allies took notice. American attachés in Moscow wrote astonished reports of the weapon's efficiency. One colonel noted the psychological power of this system exceeds its destructive yield. "It is war's first mass-produced nightmare. The Red Army had turned its pain into a sound, and that sound now defined the Eastern Front." By the summer of 1943, the German army had come to dread a particular silence, the kind that fell just before the Katyushas sang. Veterans could sense it instinctively, the sudden lull in birdsong, the faint tang of ozone in the air, the way the horizon shimmered in heat before the first wail began. At Kursk-Orel, and later at Stalingrad's ruins, it became a pattern of psychological torture. In early July 1943, as Operation Citadel began, German forces massed over 700,000 men and thousands of tanks for the largest armored battle in history. They believed their technology, Tigers, Panthers, and precise artillery would finally crush the Red Army. But what awaited them at dawn on July 5th was not a duel of machines, it was an orchestra of rockets. At 03:12, over 1,000 Katyushas fired almost simultaneously along the northern and southern sectors of the salient. Witnesses later described it as the sky opening in flame. The salvo stretched for miles, a continuous rising scream that drowned out every sound on earth. The blasts rolled across the plains like thunder, given form lifting soil and steel into the air. Tanks flipped, trenches collapsed. Even those deep in bunkers felt the ground convulse, as if the planet itself was trying to shake them off. German officers attempted to restore order, shouting commands through choking dust and fire, but discipline shattered. Radio lines crackled with frantic voices, pleas for artillery, counterfire requests for medics, disoriented reports of entire units lost contact. The once invincible armored spearheads found themselves crawling through craters filled with black smoke and twisted men. The psychological toll was devastating. One Wehrmacht sergeant later told an Allied interrogator, "It wasn't the explosions that broke us. It was the sound, the screaming sky. You knew death was coming, but you couldn't tell from where. You felt small, helpless, like the earth hated you." Across the Soviet lines, Guards mortar crews moved in synchronized rhythm, fire, reload, relocate. Their trucks left long trails of dust as they repositioned for the next salvo. Among them was Captain Ivan Andreev, now a veteran of more than 40 operations. His eyes were hollow but focused. Each time he ordered fire, he thought of the men who had fallen at Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk. Every rocket was a name, a memory, a fragment of vengeance. As smoke cleared, Soviet infantry advanced behind the wall of flame. Burned-out Tigers smoldered in the fields. German anti-tank positions lay silent. The battlefield had turned into a vast plain of ash and iron. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's mechanized superiority had been drowned not by numbers, but by sound. When the tide of war turned at Stalingrad, and later at Kursk, the Katyusha stood as the emblem of Soviet resilience, an improvised weapon built from desperation, perfected through necessity, and immortalized through terror. The same laughter that once echoed through German camps at Smolensk now returned as hollow silence in the ruins of Orel and Belgorod. Captured German diaries from 1944 reveal the depth of the psychological damage. One officer wrote, "The rockets scream before they kill. I would prefer a shell or a bullet. Those are quick. The rockets make you wait." Another entry from a medic read simply, "Every man here dreams of silence, but silence never comes." By the final year of the war, over 10,000 Katyusha launchers had been built and hundreds of thousands of rockets fired. They became the thunder behind every Soviet offensive from Leningrad's liberation to the crossing of the Oder. Even as the Red Army entered Berlin, the howling chorus followed, echoing through shattered streets, reflecting off the walls of the Reichstag. On May 8, 1945, as the guns fell silent, survivors of the Guards mortar units gathered on the ruins outside Königsberg. They stood beside their soot-streaked launchers and lit cigarettes from the smouldering barrels. No cheers, no parade. Just quiet acknowledgement that their weapon had done its part. One mechanic turned to Captain Andreev and asked, "Do you think they'll remember what it sounded like?" Andreev exhaled smoke into the grey air. "They won't forget," he said. No one forgets the scream. And in the silence that followed, even the wind seemed to carry an echo, faint, rising, almost musical, the ghost of a song once called Katyusha, the melody that had become a nation's vengeance.